The Zero pilot laughs into his radio when he sees the Grumman. Thick-winged, heavy, slow as a cargo plane compared to his nimble fighter. He banks hard, confident in the turn that has saved him a dozen times before. But Lieutenant Alex Vraciu doesn't turn with him. The Minnesota farm boy learned something the Japanese haven't figured out yet. You don't dogfight a Zero. You kill it. At 24,000 feet over the Philippine Sea, with 8 seconds until his guns reach firing range, Vraciu pulls the stick back and climbs straight up into the sun. The Zero pilot never sees what hits him. Alex Vraciu is 25 years old, with a face that still carries traces of East Chicago's steel mill district. His hands, broad and calloused from farm work before the war, rest easy on the Hellcat stick. In his flight suit pocket, he carries a photograph of his wife, not tucked away romantically, but creased and faded from being pulled out between missions, touched like a talisman before each launch. He'd arrived at VF-16 in early 1943, when the Hellcat was still new enough that carrier deck crews handled it with suspicion. The old hands flying Wildcats called it the pregnant turkey behind the pilots' backs. Too heavy, too slow in level flight. Built like a freight train when what you needed against Zeros was a sports car. But Vraciu had grown up driving tractors, machines that didn't win races but pulled impossible loads through mud. He understood the Hellcat the first time he lit the Pratt & Whitney R2800 and felt 2,000 horsepower wake up under the cowling. This wasn't a plane that turned on a dime. It was a plane that could take punishment, climb like hell, and hit like a freight train. His wingman, Ensign Homer Brockmeyer, is 19 and still writes letters to his high school sweetheart in Iowa. He keeps a photograph of his family farm tucked behind his oxygen mask fitting. Before each mission, he touches it once, not superstition, just connection. The kid has 5 confirmed kills already, but he still looks scared every time they strap in. Vraciu figures that's smart. The pilots who stop being scared are the ones who get sloppy. Life aboard USS Lexington runs on waiting. Waiting for the klaxon, waiting for intelligence. Waiting in the ready room while the air boss decides if the weather's good enough to launch. The ready room smells like coffee, cigarette smoke, and nervous sweat. Pilots play poker with matchsticks, read months-old magazines, or just stare at the bulkhead. The Hellcat itself is everywhere on deck. Dozens of them chained down, wings folded up like massive blue-gray insects. Each one carries 650 caliber Brownings, 3 per wing, with 400 rounds per gun. That's 2,400 rounds total. Enough firepower to saw a Zero in half, if you can get close enough. The plane weighs 15,000 pounds loaded, nearly twice what a Zero carries. Japanese pilots call their fighters the Wind. Americans call theirs the Iron. What they talk about isn't glory or heroics. It's practical things. How to clear a gun jam at 20,000 feet. Whether the new ammo belts feed better than the old ones. How to recognize a Zero from 1,000 yards when the sun's in your eyes. And always, always, the mathematics of energy fighting. Altitude equals speed equals life. They're afraid of getting shot down over water too far from the rescue subs. Afraid of burning. Afraid of drowning in a cockpit that fills faster than you can open the canopy. But mostly they're afraid of freezing up, of that half-second hesitation that means your wingman goes home in a body bag. The equipment they live with is simple, brutal, effective. The Hellcat's cockpit is cramped but organized, everything within reach. Stick, throttle, gun triggers, trim wheels. The gun sight is a simple ring and bead setup. You put the target in the ring, lead it just enough, and squeeze. The plane shudders when all 6 guns open up, a rhythmic hammering you feel through the stick and rudder pedals. June 19th, 1944. The ready room klaxon goes off at 5:45, 3 hours before dawn. Intelligence reports a massive Japanese carrier strike inbound, 400-plus aircraft, probably the biggest air battle of the Pacific War. Every pilot feels it. This isn't a routine patrol or a ground support mission. This is the main event. Vraciu straps in at 6:30. The deck crew handles the Hellcat with practiced efficiency. Pulling chocks, signaling clear, guiding him toward the catapult. The R-2800 idles rough, coughing blue smoke. When he pushes the throttle forward, the whole plane trembles like a dog straining at a leash. The catapult officer gives the signal. 2 seconds later, Vraciu is airborne, climbing into a sky that's about to become a killing field. At 08:05, radar picks up the Japanese strike 150 miles out. By 08:30, every Hellcat squadron in Task Force 58 is airborne, stacked in layers from 15,000 to 30,000 feet. Vraciu orbits at 24,000, watching the Pacific stretch endlessly below. His radio crackles with traffic, vectors, altitudes, fuel states. Then the call comes. Bandits bearing 2Ha-65, Angels 18, many bandits. The air boss isn't exaggerating. The radar screen looks like a snowstorm. Vraciu sees them first, a stream of dots against the horizon, growing larger. Not individual aircraft yet, just a dark smudge that means death is coming in formation. Zeros and Judies, probably 60 aircraft in this particular group. His altimeter reads 24,000 feet. They're at 18,000. He has the high ground. The Japanese formation is textbook. Bombers in the center, fighters weaving above as top cover. They haven't seen the American fighters yet, or they're not worried. Why would they be? For 3 years, Japanese pilots have owned the Pacific sky. Their Zeros can outturn anything the Americans fly. Superior maneuverability has been gospel since Pearl Harbor, but that gospel is about to be rewritten. Vraciu pushes the stick forward and rolls into a dive. The Hellcat accelerates like a stone dropping down a well. 300 knots, 350, 400. The airframe howls with speed, the wings flexing but holding. At this velocity, the Hellcat isn't slow anymore. It's a bullet with wings. The Zero pilot finally sees him at 200 yards. You can tell because the Zero brakes hard left, using that legendary turn radius. In a Wildcat, Vraciu would follow the turn and die trying to stay with him. The Zero would circle tighter, tighter, until it was on his 6 with guns blazing. But Vraciu doesn't turn. He pulls back on the stick, converting his dive speed into altitude, climbing straight up through the Zero's turn. The Zero pilot makes his fatal mistake. He tries to follow. His lightweight fighter, brilliant in a flat turn, hemorrhages energy trying to climb. The Hellcat, heavy as a truck but powered by those 2,000 horses, keeps climbing. At 600 yards, Vraciu levels out, inverts, and comes down on the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot sees him too late, tries one last desperate break. Vraciu puts the gunsight ring on the Zero's engine, cowling, and presses both triggers. 6 50s open up at once. The sound is like God ripping apart a tin roof. Tracers converge on the Zero, bright green, every 5th round visible as it arcs across the gap. The impact is immediate and catastrophic. The Zero's engine cowling disintegrates, pieces spinning away in the slipstream. White smoke turns black. Flames appear. The Zero rolls left, trailing fire, and starts the long fall toward the ocean. Vraciu doesn't watch. He's already scanning for the next target. The sky has become chaos. Hellcats and Zeros wheel and dive through each other, contrails marking every desperate maneuver. Explosions bloom like flowers, some bright orange as fuel tanks ignite, others dull red as ammunition cooks off. Aircraft fall burning, parachutes blossom white. The radio is a wall of noise. Brake right. 6 o'clock. I'm hit. Where's my wingman? Vraciu spots another Zero, this one chasing a Hellcat in a turning fight. Bad tactics, The Hellcat pilot is trying to turn with the Zero, exactly what you're not supposed to do. The Zero is gaining, closing to gun range. Vraciu drops down behind both of them, lines up on the Zero, fires. This burst is shorter, 50 rounds maybe, but enough. The Zero's tail section comes apart. Control surfaces flutter free. The fighter snaps into a spin and goes down. Time compresses. Later, Vraciu won't remember the sequence clearly. He'll remember moments, the smell of cordite filling the cockpit when the guns fire, the way his hands shake from adrenaline, the G-forces crushing him into the seat during a hard turn. He'll remember a Zero coming head-on, both fighters firing, the insanity of closing at a combined 600 miles per hour with guns blazing. He'll remember pulling up at the last second, looking back to see the Zero streaming smoke. The fight spreads across 50 miles of sky. Hellcats have the altitude, the speed, the firepower. But the Japanese have numbers and desperation. A burning Judy bomber tries to ram a Hellcat. The American fighter dodges at the last instant. The bomber cartwheels past and disintegrates. 2 Zeros gang up on a lone Hellcat, but his wingman arrives from above, guns hammering. 1 Zero explodes immediately. The other breaks away, trailing smoke. Vraciu's fourth kill is a Judy dive bomber. He comes down on it from the rear quarter, squeezes a 3-second burst. The rear gunner never gets a shot off. The bomber's wing folds, and it tumbles sideways into the ocean. His fifth is another Zero, caught in a climb, engine screaming. Vraciu fires from directly below, a deflection shot that shouldn't work, but does. The Zero flips onto its back and falls. His sixth kill happens at 09:20. By then, his guns are almost empty, maybe 200 rounds left total. He finds a Zero limping away from the fight. Smoking badly, losing altitude. The pilot is probably wounded or out of ammunition. Vraciu lines up, fires one last burst. The Zero's engine quits. The canopy opens. A figure tumbles out, parachute blooming white. Vraciu orbits once, watching the pilot drift down toward the water, then turns for home. The flight back to Lexington takes 30 minutes. His fuel gauge reads 20 gallons. His hands won't stop shaking. When he finally sets the Hellcat down on the carrier deck, he sits in the cockpit for a full minute before he can move. The deck crew has to help him out. His flight suit is soaked through with sweat. Later, when the gun camera film is developed, it will confirm 6 kills in a single mission. But right now, all he can think about is the Zero pilot in the parachute, drifting down toward an ocean that stretches 1,000 miles in every direction. The task force counts the butcher's bill at sunset. The Japanese lost 315 aircraft in what will be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the most lopsided air battle in history. American losses, 29 aircraft. Of those, most were operational accidents or ships' gunfire hitting their own planes. The Hellcat squadrons lost 12 pilots killed. VF-16 lost 2. Ensign Brockmeyer isn't one of them, but he's different now. He landed with his Hellcat shot full of holes, cannon rounds through the left wing, machine gun fire stitching the fuselage. He walked away without a scratch, but something broke anyway. In the ready room afterward, he doesn't joke or play cards. He just sits there, staring at nothing. His hands shake when he lights a cigarette. Vraciu sits next to him, doesn't say anything. There's nothing to say. The 2 pilots they lost were from another section. Lieutenant Miller took a 20mm shell through the cockpit. The canopy never opened. His wingman saw him go in, still strapped in his seat, the Hellcat hitting the water at 300 knots. They searched for 6 hours, found nothing. His belongings, a watch, some letters, a photograph of his wife and 2 daughters, go into a canvas bag for shipping stateside. Ensign Kowalski died differently. His plane was burning, but he stayed in the fight long enough to nail the Zero that got him. Then he bailed out. They saw his chute open. A destroyer picked him up 2 hours later. He was alive when they pulled him from the water. He died in the sick bay from burns covering 60% of his body. The medics did what they could, but burns that severe in the middle of the Pacific, with no real hospital for 1,000 miles. He lasted 3 hours. They buried him at sea the next morning. That night, the surviving pilots drink bad coffee in the ready room and talk in circles. Not about the kills or the victory. About the moment when you pull the trigger and watch another human being die. About whether it gets easier. Whether it should get easier. About going home someday and trying to explain what this was like to people who think war is what they see in newsreels. Some of them can't stop talking. They replay every second of the fight, gesturing with their hands, reliving each maneuver. Others sit silent, smoking cigarettes down to the filter. Vraciu writes a letter to his wife. He doesn't mention the 6 kills. He doesn't mention that he's now an ace. He writes about missing her, about wanting to be home, about hoping the war ends soon. The important things. The squadron CO makes the rounds, checking on each pilot personally. He knows who's solid, who's shaky, who's one mission away from breaking. This is the part that doesn't make it into combat reports. The slow erosion of watching friends die, of killing strangers, of coming back day after day to do it again. Later, intelligence will piece together what happened. The Japanese launched their carrier strike expecting to overwhelm the American fleet through numbers and superior pilot skill. They had 430 aircraft. They had veteran pilots who trained for years. They had the legendary Zero, the fighter that terrorized the Pacific for 3 years. What they didn't have was an answer for the Hellcat. For 3 years, Japanese tactical doctrine centered on the turning dogfight. The Zero won those fights through tighter turn radius and better maneuverability. But the Hellcat pilots simply refused to fight that way. They didn't turn. They climbed. They dived. They used altitude and speed, not agility. Energy fighting, the Americans called it. Physics, not finesse. The Japanese lost more than aircraft that day. They lost their experienced carrier pilots, the men who'd flown since China, since Pearl Harbor. The Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered. After June 19, 1944, Japanese carrier aviation was finished as an effective fighting force. They had carriers, but no pilots good enough to fly from them. The official after-action report calls it a decisive victory. Numbers and percentages. Kill ratios. Mission accomplished. What the report doesn't capture is Ensign Kowalski burning to death in a sick bay, or Lieutenant Miller hitting the water at terminal velocity, or Brockmeyer's hands shaking 3 days later. The official history is clean. The reality never is. The F6F Hellcat wasn't a miracle weapon. It was heavier than the Zero, less maneuverable, less elegant. On paper, it should have lost. But warfare isn't fought on paper. The Hellcat won because American engineers understood something the Japanese didn't. In modern air combat, energy matters more than agility. A heavier plane with more power could control the engagement, dictate the terms, fight on its own terms. More importantly, the American pilots learned to use those advantages. They abandoned dogfighting. They developed tactics. The thatch weave, the boom and zoom attack, the high side run that played to the Hellcat's strengths. Japanese pilots kept fighting the way they'd always fought, expecting their superior skill to prevail. It didn't. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot proved that doctrine matters more than hardware. The Zero was still a good plane, but it was flown by pilots trained in tactics that no longer worked against an enemy that had learned to fight differently. The Japanese mocked the Hellcat as slow and clumsy. Then they died in their hundreds. Alex Vraciu survived the war with 19 confirmed kills, making him one of the Navy's top aces. He came home to East Chicago, married his sweetheart, and never talked much about what he'd done. When reporters asked about his 6 kills in one mission, he'd shrug and say he got lucky. He knew better. Luck is what keeps you alive when someone's shooting at you. Skill is what lets you shoot back. The F6F Hellcat ended the war with a kill ratio of 19.1, 19 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air combat. It was the most successful fighter in naval aviation history. Grumman built 12,275 of them. They equipped 13 fleet carriers, destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft, and proved that understanding the problem matters more than building the perfect machine. The families of Lieutenant Miller and Ensign Kowalski received telegrams saying their boys died heroically in defense of their country, which was true as far as it went. What the telegrams didn't say was that Miller had a daughter who just turned 3, who would grow up not remembering her father's face, or that Kowalski's mother would keep his room exactly as he'd left it for 30 years, unable to accept that he wasn't coming home. The story of the Hellcat matters because it's not really about airplanes. It's about adapting faster than your enemy, about recognizing that yesterday's advantages don't guarantee tomorrow's victories, about young men who learned to fight differently because the old ways would get them killed. The Japanese mocked the Hellcat as slow. Then they learned the hard way that fast doesn't matter if you're dead. 60 years later, at the F6F reunion, Vraciu met a former Japanese Zero pilot. They shook hands, 2 old men who'd spent their youth trying to kill each other. The Japanese pilot bowed and said, through a translator, that he'd always respected the Hellcat. "We underestimated your plane," he said, "and we underestimated your tactics." Vraciu nodded. He didn't mention the 6 kills. He didn't need to. They both knew what those numbers meant. Not glory, just survival, purchased with the lives of strangers who were doing their jobs the same as he was doing his. That's the truth about air combat. The rest is propaganda.